Dr. Ned Ketyer is a Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area pediatrician who enjoyed 26 years in private practice before retiring from patient care in 2017. He remains a member of the American Academy of Pediatrics Council on Environmental Health and is a board member of PSR Pennsylvania. Dr. Ketyer is a consultant for the Southwest Pennsylvania Environmental Health Project, bringing attention to the health impacts of fracking in the Marcellus Shale gas patch. Dr. Ketyer's work connects the rapid expansion of shale gas and petrochemical development in the Ohio River Valley with local and regional health impacts experienced by residents and the global economic and public health catastrophes resulting from plastic pollution and climate change that threaten the health and well-being of all passengers on this shining ball of blue. If you have a question, use the Q&A box, mention Ned while he's presenting. And now, Dr. Ned Ketyer.
My name is Ned Ketyer. Today, I am pleased to talk about how fracking threatens children's health at the wellhead and beyond. I have no financial interest, no financial conflicts of interest to report, but I do have three very personal conflicts of interest who motivate me to give presentations like this one today. I took this photograph of my three sons when we visited Colorado in 2006. They're all grown up now, and like so many young adults today, they are sensitive to the threats to their health and safety caused by pollution, by fracking, environmental racism, and climate change. This is what fracking looks like in Pennsylvania, which is the second largest gas producing state in the nation. There are now more than 12,600 active shale gas wells in the state, which you see as the purple dots on this updated frac tracker map. Most of the activity is in northeastern and southwestern Pennsylvania, and almost all of it has happened in the last 10 to 12 years. The green dots show where several hundred compressor stations are that move the gas along through the pipelines, and the yellow dots indicate where violations have occurred so far. And as you can see, there are many more violations than there are wells in Pennsylvania. It's helpful to understand why all this drilling and fracking is going on in Southwest Pennsylvania in the first place. Yes, fracking does produce methane that we use to generate electricity and heat our homes and cook our food. But the real prize in this region of the Marcellus Shale is ethane, a liquid hydrocarbon released from the shale alongside methane and used to make plastics and other petrochemicals. All of these wells that you see as orange dots on this frac tracker map in Southwest Pennsylvania, in Eastern Ohio, in West Virginia, on both sides of the Ohio River, produce ethane, which will feed this massive ethane cracker plant being built by Royal Dutch Shell just 24 miles down the Ohio River and upwind from downtown Pittsburgh. The cracker plant is one of the largest ever built anywhere, will transform fracked ethane molecules into ethylene. Once the plant is completed and operational in the next couple of years, it will produce millions of tons of these tiny plastic polyethylene pellets called nurdles. Nearly 2 trillion nurdles will be produced every year from just one cracker plant. Several other cracker plants are expected to be built in the Ohio River over the next decade or so. At least 1,000 new fracked wells drilled every year will be needed to feed this petrochemical hub and what we expect to become America's next cancer alley. All to make more single-use plastic, which, as you all know, is one thing that nature doesn't need any more of. Plastic's life cycle begins at the wellhead, but it's important to recognize that it threatens human health throughout its life cycle, from fracking for ethane to production of plastic nurdles to the manufacturing of consumer products, most of which are designed for single use, to the waste stream where most plastic ends up. Scientists are quickly learning that the toxic emissions and chemicals associated with fracking and plastic are harmful to our health throughout our life cycle. Many are highly irritating to our lungs, our gastrointestinal tract, and our skin. Many affect the outcome of pregnancies and interfere with fetal and infant growth and brain development. We now understand how some toxics act as endocrine disrupting chemicals, affecting human development and reproduction. Some weaken the immune system, some increase the risk of chronic inflammatory diseases, some damage end organs directly, especially the brain, liver, and kidneys. And dozens of chemicals appearing in the life of plastic are linked to cancers in adults and in children, including 55 individual chemicals used in fracking. Plastic is strong, it's durable, and it's cheap, but these same properties that make plastic so useful to our society, strength, durability, and affordability, make plastic so dangerous when it is finally disposed of after being used for 15 seconds, 15 minutes, 15 years, and in a few cases, even longer. Once in the environment, plastic breaks down and erodes into smaller units, eventually becoming tiny particles called microplastics, which are carried by winds and in currents to faraway places. As this happens, the chemicals added to plastic separate and contaminate the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the soil in which we grow our food, causing harm to all life forms, including us and generations to come. Let's return to the wellhead and take a quick look at what horizontal drilling and high volume hydraulic fracturing is all about. A well is drilled straight down into an ancient shale formation, typically a mile or more under our feet. The well is turned horizontally, and the drilling continues out laterally through the shale for a few miles more. Locked in the shale is methane, ethane, oil, and other hydrocarbons. Incidentally, the Marcellus Shale contains mostly gas and natural gas liquids, but very little oil. Once the well is drilled and its pipes cemented in place, the frackers come in and force millions of gallons of fresh water, chemicals, and sand into the well at enormous pressures to fracture the shale and allow those hydrocarbons to be released and collected at the wellhead. But that's not all that comes up. Solid drill cuttings, rock and dirt, and salty corrosive brine return to the surface. The solid and liquid flowback are contaminated with fracking chemicals, heavy metals, and other earth elements normally found in these radioactive shale formations. Pennsylvania's Marcellus Shale is highly radioactive with water-soluble radium-226 with a half-life of 1,600 years, and radium-228 with a half-life of just under 6 years. We often see brine trucks on Pennsylvania roads and highways with the words residual waste stenciled on the side. But these trucks carrying the toxic flowback destined for deep underground injection wells and municipal and commercial landfills should be more accurately labeled as radioactive toxic waste. From landfills, toxic and radioactive leachate finds its way into our area's rivers and streams where communities source their drinking water. Flowback waste disposed of in deep underground injection wells has been shown to contaminate streams and produce earthquakes. In addition, some of the toxic wastewater is packaged and marketed to municipalities and consumers as de-icing agents and pool salts. Non-fuel gases like volatile organic compounds, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and hydrogen sulfide, the fumes of fossil fuels, return to the surface and contaminate the air we breathe. VOCs like benzene cause cancer in children and adults. Toluene is another VOC that can cause permanent neurologic damage. Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are also a dangerous component of shale gas. Some of these act as endocrine disrupting chemicals, which interfere with hormone functions in the body, especially from growth and brain development in infants and children. In adults, exposure can lead to cancer. I've already mentioned it, but one of the worst kept secrets about fracking is the radioactivity brought back up to the surface. Geologists have actually known about it for many decades, but radioactivity is not even an afterthought for the industry or for environmental and health regulators. Radium-226 decays into radon gas, which has been shown to collect in basements and crawl spaces in homes near fracked gas sites. Radon is the second leading cause of lung cancer behind tobacco smoke. Finally, large volumes of methane leak inadvertently and are vented and flared on purpose into the atmosphere during fracking operations. Methane is an extremely potent greenhouse gas, trapping heat in the atmosphere 86 times more effectively than carbon dioxide over a 20-year time frame. Methane leaks like crazy from fracked gas infrastructure. Any greenhouse gas savings you might get from burning natural gas instead of coal is instead squandered by allowing methane to carelessly escape from fracked gas infrastructure. Instead of being a bridge fuel to a cleaner and more sustainable energy future, fracked gas is actually a bridge on the highway leading to climate catastrophe. The wellhead isn't the only place where harmful pollution is generated. Air, water, and soil is contaminated at every point of fracked gas infrastructure. Diesel emissions result from the thousands of heavy trucks needed to service each well, and diesel engines on well pads that generate the enormous pressures necessary to fracture the shale. Pipelines scar the landscape. They occasionally leak and spill, and they can corrode and explode. Pigging stations maintain the patency of pipelines by launching air toxics into the atmosphere. Compressor stations emit copious volumes of air pollutants, fine particulate matter, ozone-forming nitrogen oxides, cancer-causing VOCs, radon gas, and greenhouse gases. Pollution continues at gas processing facilities that separate and refine the hydrocarbons, and then beyond at local cracker plants and other petrochemical facilities. Finally, not all of the fracked oil and gas is used locally. Instead, a large amount is exported to other states and to distant countries with an insatiable appetite for, among other things, single-use plastic. Fracking happens in neighborhoods where people live and children play. In Pennsylvania and Colorado, the minimum setback distance from a fracked gas site to a home, a child care center, a school, or other building is 500 feet. Fracking happens where kids go to school. In Pennsylvania, 1.5 million residents live within a half mile of a fracked gas site. 300,000 children attend childcare within a half mile. The school district you see here is now surrounded by 5 well pads and a network of pipelines and compressor stations that transport fracked gas to a huge gas processing facility just a few miles away. The Torelli pad that you see there on the left is just 900 feet from the only entrance and exit of this school. Fracking happens where children play. I can't imagine that any parent, pediatrician, or nurse would look at this scene and find it acceptable in any way. So minimum setback distances from oil and gas development are meant to minimize health and safety risks to the public. In Colorado and in Pennsylvania too, the minimum setback distance is 500 feet. On this slide, you can see the overall consensus based on evidence is leading to urgent calls for greater setback distances from oil and gas sites. The state of Maryland decided in 2014 on a minimum setback distance of 2,000 feet before thinking better of it and banning fracking altogether. In June, a Pennsylvania grand jury investigating criminal conduct by the oil and gas industry and corruption by state regulators recommended new rules to protect public safety and health from fracking. Calling the current minimum setback of 500 feet dangerously close, the grand jury recommended increasing the minimum setbacks to 2,500 feet from homes and 5,000 feet from schools, hospitals, and other sensitive buildings. Environmental Health Project recommends a minimum setback of 1 kilometer for smaller infrastructure like small well pads and 2 kilometers for larger sites like the super well pads with dozens of wells on them, compressor stations, and processing facilities. Last year, a report commissioned by the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment confirmed that current setbacks are indeed dangerously close. The report highlighted possible negative health impacts up to 2,000 feet, but didn't examine impacts further away. Exposure to toxic chemicals in the environment occur in three ways: inhalation, ingestion, and contact and absorption through the skin. Several factors determine the significance of exposure. How close you are to the emissions, how long you're exposed are two major factors. Significant exposures and subsequent health impacts may be related to individual susceptibility based on age, on gender, on genetic and immune factors, some of which we don't fully understand yet, and the presence of pre-existing medical conditions. Exposure may be continuous, or in the case of oil and gas operations, more sporadic, depending on the phase and intensity of the industrial activity. Exposure may involve multiple chemicals at the same time from one or from multiple sources in the vicinity of the exposed person. Let me show you an example of aggregate emissions in an oil and gas patch in Colorado. So this is the Platte Valley High School in Weld County, one of the most heavily fracked counties in Colorado. Zooming out, you immediately find 6 unconventional well pads close to the school. The nearest well pad is around 1,300 feet. Let's zoom out some more, and you can see that students and residents in this small corner of Weld County are surrounded by fracked oil and gas development. The pink balloons indicate well pads with more than 2 wells on them. The yellow thumbtacks that you see are compressor stations. I didn't include single unconventional wells or any of the conventional wells scattered all over the map and seen especially on the far right side of the map. This little snapshot was pretty disturbing to me. And it was disturbing to the rulemaking committee of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission when I testified at a public hearing in early September. The committee has since endorsed setting minimum setback distances at 2,000 feet from new oil and gas wells. Air pollution from fracking consists mostly of invisible fine particles and colorless gas. Invisible pollution also includes radioactive particles, which have been detected in the air with monitors downwind from unconventional oil and gas wells. According to a recent Harvard study published in October, living up to 20 kilometers downwind from unconventional oil and gas development increases the risk of exposure to radioactivity above normal background levels. If you are close to fracked oil and gas wells, then you have a higher risk of health damage from radioactivity. The adverse health impacts from fracking are well documented in PSR's Fracking Science Compendium, which is available online. Now in its 7th edition, more than 1,700 peer-reviewed studies and investigative reports found no evidence that fracking can operate without threatening public health directly or without imperiling climate stability upon which public health depends. It shouldn't surprise anyone that women and children are at the top of the list of impacted residents. We know that people who live and work and children who learn and play near fracked gas sites are vulnerable to environmental degradation and pollution from fracking. And we know now from abundant research in Pennsylvania and other states, and from a Pennsylvania grand jury report released over the summer, that children are being impacted and their health is being damaged. Multiple studies now show that living near fracking sites can complicate pregnancies. Maternal exposure before and during gestation has been shown to result in poor birth outcomes like prematurity, low birth weight, and small for gestational age newborns. The health risks to infants and children living near shale gas development are especially concerning. Tiny amounts of toxics transmitted from mother to fetus through the placenta can lead to fetal anomalies, birth defects, and developmental delays. Some of the chemicals discharged during fracking operations act as endocrine disrupting chemicals in the body. Even tiny amounts have been shown to interfere with infant growth and child development and are linked to major problems with cognitive and brain development. Every one of these adverse birth outcomes has lifelong adverse consequences. Children are not little adults. They are more vulnerable to pollution because their behaviors and interactions with the environment increase their risk of exposure. Children eat more food, drink more water, and breathe more air per unit body weight than adults. They spend more time playing outdoors, playing in the grass and the dirt, close to the ground where pollution settles. They put everything in their mouths: dirt, rocks, toys, dirty hands and fingers, and food. Their rapidly developing and rapidly growing bodies are susceptible to damage from toxics. Their blood-brain barrier is immature and more porous, allowing toxic chemicals access to the brain and the nervous system. This is one reason why we see examples of early exposure leading to lifelong cognitive deficits, motor delays, behavioral problems, and even mental illness. Children do not have the same capacity as adults to neutralize and get rid of synthetic chemicals that enter the bloodstream. And even if they did, the capacity to protect oneself from chemicals is not limitless. There is a certain threshold of exposure that no person can withstand. That threshold is significantly lower in children, especially young children. One reason is that they produce lower levels of chemical binding proteins that help detoxify the body. And we know that organs and body systems that are still developing are more vulnerable to damage. Children have a long shelf life. That means that the signs and symptoms of some diseases may not be felt for years to decades after exposure to toxic chemicals and pollution. We see this with lung diseases like silicosis, which can appear decades after exposure to sand and silica dust. Chronic obstructive lung disease doesn't develop until many years after exposure, even though lung damage begins during childhood and adolescence. It takes years to develop symptoms of heart disease and strokes. And cancers have long latency periods, sometimes decades for tumors to appear. And let's remember that the most important predictor of poor health in adults is poor health in childhood. In addition to mothers and youngsters, older people and those with limited financial resources are at risk, as are people of color, who often live in environmental justice zones close to polluting industries like the oil and gas and petrochemical industry. Residents who have existing medical conditions like chronic lung disease, heart disease, kidney disease, mental illness, and children with asthma are at higher risk for having exacerbations of those diseases. Fracking jobs are some of the most dangerous jobs in America. Industry workers who are exposed to physical injury, air pollution, chemicals, and radiation may not have the personal protective equipment and training necessary to protect themselves and their families from harm. And we shouldn't forget our first responders. In the United States, the shale gas industry is not legally required to disclose the identity of the chemicals used in fracking operations. This secrecy puts first responders at a disadvantage when called on to respond to an emergency, and it puts their health and safety in danger. People who live near fracked gas operations report many different adverse health symptoms. Environmental Health Project published a study in 2017 looking at health symptoms of adult residents living within 1 kilometer of a well pad. Sleep disruption is often the result of nonstop truck activity, noise, odors, and light while a well is being drilled and fracked. Headaches, throat irritation, and respiratory symptoms are also widely reported. Stress and anxiety are side effects exacerbated by living near fracking sites. Crime, drug and alcohol abuse, sex trafficking, sexually transmitted infections, and traffic fatalities happen at higher rates wherever fracking takes place. Some of these symptoms that you see here look like nuisance complaints, but for people who are exposed to fracking activities and the pollution it causes day in and day out, month in, month out, and year out, with the development of super well pads that, again, have dozens of wells on them. These acute symptoms of exposure and stress can become chronic medical problems. So we know that infants, children, and adults living near fracked oil and gas operations are getting sick. And we also know that some of the chemicals associated with fracking can increase the risk of cancer. From 2008 to 2018, in 4 heavily fracked counties in southwestern Pennsylvania, 2 reporters at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette uncovered 27 cases of Ewing sarcoma, which is a frequently fatal and very rare bone cancer in children, and 40 cases of other rare cancers, for a total of 67 rare cancers in children, teenagers, and young adults. In Washington County, Pennsylvania, where I live and work, 6 cases of Ewing sarcoma and 30 other rare childhood cancers were counted. These numbers are far more than would be expected to occur in a similarly populated, mostly rural area over a 10-year time frame. And new cases keep popping up in this region. Parents and physicians are very concerned that pollution and toxic waste from fracking operations may be to blame for this outbreak of rare childhood cancers. The Pennsylvania Department of Health has commissioned 2 new studies to examine the causes of this cancer crisis. Results are expected in about 3 years. In the meantime, in June, a Pennsylvania grand jury released a scathing report about the harms to health, property, and livelihoods of Pennsylvanians living and working near fracked gas operations. In addition to proving criminality within the industry, the grand jury uncovered negligence, incompetence, corruption, and complicity by the Department of Environmental Protection and the Department of Health, 2 government agencies in charge of regulating an industry that has caused so much damage to public health. Time and again in its report, the grand jury kept returning to the fact that it was children in the gas patch whose health was suffering the most. The grand jury went on to give 8 recommendations for state regulators to try to fix the problems they found and so clearly documented in the report. But reading between the lines of this report, it is clear that the risks from fracking are inevitable because fracking is inherently dirty and dangerous. And government regulations and industry rules will unlikely fix that fact. The evidence is in, and it's indisputable. Fracked gas makes people sick, degrades the environment and the ecosystems necessary to sustain all life, and accelerates global warming and climate change. And we all know that climate change is a medical emergency. In fact, the health impacts of climate change demand immediate action, says practically every public health and medical organization in the United States and around the world. So I'm going to stop here, and I'd like to thank my colleagues at PSR Colorado for inviting me to speak today. It's pretty clear, I think, that from our cradle to our grave, our health is threatened by pollution from oil and gas development and by plastic and petrochemical pollution. So things need to change. Children have the most to lose if we don't change, and the most to gain if we do. As a pediatrician and a father, I know that children live in a world shaped by our choices. For our kids, a safe and healthy future depends on how wisely and how quickly we choose to act responsibly to protect the health of the planet and all its inhabitants. We've run out of time to make any other choice. Thank you.